RedBar and the organizer of the event. With me on stage are the Disruptors for our panel, which is talking about the next generation of watches. So to my left is Roland Murphy from RGM Watches. Roland is a watchmaker and the founder of RGM Watch Company, trained at Bowman Technical School in Lancaster and the Watchmakers of Switzerland training and educational program. With a love for watch history and restoring watches, he started RGM in 1992 and continues today to produce classic-style American-made bespoke timepieces. Next to him is John Ferrer, the designer and founder of Brew Watch Company. John is a watch designer and founder of Brew. He has worked professionally in the watch industry for 8 years, studied industrial design at New Jersey Institute of Technology, where he is currently an adjunct design and manufacturing professor. With a strong belief in the ritual of the daily coffee break, his Brew watch collection draws inspiration from the mechanisms and aesthetics of industrial espresso machines. Next to John is Joshua Shapiro, owner of J.N. Shapiro Watches. Those of you in New York may have seen him lecture at the Horological Society recently about his watches and what he's doing. Joshua is a watchmaker based in Los Angeles, studied watchmaking through the British Horological Institute, and apprenticed with watch and clockmaker David Walter. He specializes in engine turning, and his dials are among the most intricate in the world. And they're really cool. Just FYI, I've been to his workshop, it's kind of awesome. I've also been to Roland's, and I highly recommend visiting if you can. In addition to watchmaking, Shapiro works as a high school principal and holds a BA from UCLA and an MA from CSUN, both in history. And last but certainly not least is Ian Schon, founder, designer, and engineer at Schon Horology. I like to talk about Ian as a little bit of a mad scientist, which in the very best way possible. He's a designer and watchmaker who's passionate about the methodology, process, and development of timepieces by hand and the making of parts from innovative materials. Formerly a senior product designer at IDEO in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he also runs Schon Design, which makes heirloom quality pens, some of which are here on the table that you can look at after the panel. So, with that said, I'm going to just jump right into it and start with a question for all of you, which is, what drives you forward as a designer, and what inspires you to create independently outside of a traditional corporate hierarchy? Start with Roland.
I'm the oldest.
Still, you're doing you have your own company, and you're doing something outside of the traditional kind of big corporate watch world. So what drives you forward? What makes you keep going with that?
Well, I started. I worked for a long time ago. I worked for S&H, which was the forerunner to Swatch Group. I worked in product development for Hamilton, and I enjoyed that. I learned a lot, but I wanted to kind of make watches my own way. A little closer. Okay. So I wanted to make watches the way that I wanted to make watches, so I was able to break away from that, start my own company. Very small to start with, still quite small. We're about 11 people, but I think being small is important if you want to do what you want to do and enjoy that. So. I could have worked stayed with a big brand or something like that, but that just didn't interest me. I think it comes down to personal preference, what you want to do. I have a little more control over what I make and what I do and my time. And so it wasn't really like a grand scheme. It's really, for me, it was just to be able to make a living at what I enjoy doing as a watchmaker. I'm a watchmaker. I didn't take any business or anything like that. So. I'm sure other people could run businesses better than I do, but as a watchmaker, I've been able to achieve that now. We're over 26 years since I started, so I've been able to spend most of my life doing what I enjoy doing.
Joshua, same question.
Well, first, I just want to say I'm kind of honored to be up here with Roland. He really paved the way for American watchmakers to do what they're doing, to really revitalize from nothing. I don't know if there's anyone in between you and Hamilton that's doing what you're doing, so I just want to acknowledge it's very nice to be up here with you, and Thank you for leading the way for all of us.
Thank you.
And myself, I got into this as a hobby, and it grew from there. And sort of the thing that was guiding me all along was I wanted to see how far I could progress my skill and learn about watchmaking and see what I could accomplish. And my goal with my watch is that someone looks at it and gets inspired to do whatever it is that they want to do. That you never know how far you can go with your skill and talents until you really pursue it all the way. And that continues to be my goal with my company. I look at every dial, every watch, every part that I make and think, how can I make this better? What mistakes have I made? How can I grow? How can I continue to grow? And that's sort of the guiding philosophy for me.
John?
Okay, so what actually got me inspired to start and continue to do what I'm doing today? So originally I started interning and working for Movado, and then after I worked for other licensed brands that you see rolling through Macy's and Nordstrom. And the thing I enjoyed the most was the process of designing and getting these design guidelines and working on these for these different clients. But the more I did it, the more I realized we were designing generic watches for the mass market. So I enjoyed the process. I just didn't enjoy the outcome and result because they were mass market watches. They were affordable because the quality was quite low. The materials used were too a different tier. So I said to myself, if I wanted to do this my own way, which I think we all ask ourselves, is how would I do it? And I decided, I had the process down, I had the suppliers ready. The thing that I enjoyed doing was just working in cafes, designing things, whether it was watches or lamps or different product designs. And I said, well, I'm not a race car driver, I'm not a diver, I'm not a pilot. What is my story and what is something that other people could relate to? And it may seem cliche on the outside to the average person, but I think if you dig deeper, it's about enjoying your time over a coffee, whether it's a date, your personal time, designing. So I said, okay, that's my first thing. That's my brand. Now, when I look around the room, I can call out specific brands, whether it's a Longe, a Seiko, when I saw like an FP, like you see the profile, you see the dial, instantly you capture that brand. So what would my silhouette be? What would my brand story be in an instant? Because there's just so many round stamped out watches in the mass market, I wanted to stand out for a special reason. And not just to be different, but different with a reason. So I chose specific silhouettes, a specific story, and a specific tier of materials and manufacturing that still rolls out to today. It's like a very consistent story and product.
Ian, same question. What drives you forward as a designer and what inspires you to continue working independently?
So I always look towards the handmade bicycle frame builders and the knife makers, because these are individuals most of the time, or small groups of craftspeople who want to make things their way. And they would go out of their way to make a product that was so different than what you could buy in the store. Something that could give you custom geometry, a different type of finish, a different treatment, and almost a radical approach to what I considered a bicycle at the time, or what a handmade knife was. And I was so inspired by that model that I said, what is frame building for watches? How do we make, like in America, there's a huge industry of like small frame builders, like dozens and dozens across every city that make like a handmade bicycle or a knife maker makes a handmade knife. And I thought it was so cool to say, let's apply that to watchmaking and bring a new class, like try and inspire a whole new wave of makers that are just making frames or making cases or dials or hands, and bring back the craft side of it and try and keep it hyper local. Like, what if we could all walk down the street and meet with our local watch repair person and our watch case maker and do projects with them and make commissions? I think that would be so special. So I was inspired by that, and I started making watch cases in my bedroom in Brookline, Massachusetts. And now, I guess 5 years later, I'm in Philadelphia, and I have a 2,700 square foot manufacturing facility with a Swiss style lathe, which I produce pen parts on, and 3-axis CNC mill, and a couple other manual pieces of equipment where I make my watch cases, my hands, my dials, and these pens, and who knows what else. So
Great, thank you. So I actually want to talk about a little bit about innovation, because all of you are doing something, I think, innovative in very, sometimes different ways. But specifically, I want to ask for Josh and Roland about the blending of historic and modern techniques, because I think you both are doing that. How have traditional methods inspired you to create, and what are you using with modern techniques to combine with those traditional methods and make what you're making? Josh, you want to start with that?
So I have a few degrees in history, so I'm really fascinated with the machinery of watchmaking. I joke with these other guys up here that with watch collectors, we talk about watches, but with other watchmakers, you talk about tools. And we can talk about tools a lot. So, the tools themselves that you make watches out of are just as interesting as the watches themselves. And Roland and I both have a lot of really old Rose engine and straight line machines, and these machines have a lot of history behind them, where they've been pre-World War I, post-World War II, what was going on in the world when they were made, and the fact that we can still use them and produce great results with them, even though these machines are 60, 70, 80, 100, 150 years old, is really neat. And then it's a decision of where do we want to use modern machinery in that place. Like, for instance, I personally would never want to use my CNC machine for my engine tuning, for my guilloche. But for some processes that would be very difficult to do by hand, that I need precision, I need repeatability, that's when I'd use a CNC machine for that. And that's all right. That's part of the process. Some companies decide to go no CNC whatsoever, and so they put a lot of love and labor into every watch, and they make a few watches a year. But as a businessman, I had to decide how best to use my time and where to invest my energy. And I've chosen to invest my energy, the majority of it, sitting behind one of these old machines, appreciating it, and seeing what I can make with it.
Roland, same question. How are you blending, historic techniques with modern technology to create your watches?
How we do that is, I've always been, since I found I loved watches, when I first went to watchmaking school, and I was always sort of a student of studying about the early American watch companies and some of the Swiss ones. The history, how they did things, fascinated me. So a lot of, if you look at RGM watches on our website, you'll see a lot of what we do is very classic. We're not doing, very sort of outlandish or extremely modern. It's very classic things, and the work that we do is that way too. So like Josh, we do the engine turning, the guilloche work is done by hand. It's not using CNC or some other way of doing it, not stamped either. But we do use CNC machines to make things like main plates, bridges, to make that raw part, but it's a precise part. And then from there, it's all hand finished. And at the end, our watch movements that we build, part of our line, we actually build movements, 90% of the movement ourselves. Then that is all fit and finished, adjusted by an individual or a few individuals to complete the finished watch movement. So there is a blend of some modern, but using also mostly the classic way of doing things with the tools, the machines, hand tools, and a person. So that's how we blended it, and we're very classic. One thing I like about making classic watches is they don't seem to go out of style really either. But I don't make things based on what I think the market wants. I've always made, people say, how do you do this? Do you do market study? Do that? No, I've just always made watches that I liked in hopes that others would like them too.
That's actually a question I was going to ask a little later, but now that you brought it up, I think it's great. It's a question for all of you. How do you make the I know how you make the decisions, but how do you make the decision on what kind of design you want? Do you look at what the market is after, or are you just making things that you personally love, or is it a blend of the two? John?
Okay, so this is, I could talk about success and failure on this one. So when I originally came out with a square watch. And when I speak to industry professionals, they always say, why would you ever make a square watch? That's the least sellable watch. Because visually, people purchase what they're most comfortable with, what is on the market, what is trending. So to come out with a square watch was kind of a little backwards to come out with, but I saw it as something bold. And then over time, I produced an automatic watch that was round opening. Also, it was good. And then I kept having people ask, could I have a slimmer watch? Could I have a round watch? And I came out with one. I tested a prototype, and it was an absolute flop. You know why? And I talked to Max Booser, actually, and I asked him for one piece of advice. And I said, same question. What part of your designs is user feedback, and what part is personal passion? To which he responded with, it's 100% personal passion, because the minute you start delivering a product that people expect, a product that people are asking for, your crowd is designing the watch, and it's not you, so it's not really your brand, and it's not what people are really are following and enjoying from you. So it was like a little bit of a fire underneath me. I was like, wow, okay, well, I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing, stick to my story even that much further. So I enjoy making these retro, square style watches, not just because they're different, but because it's what I personally enjoy. To Roland's point, it's you want to continue doing what you enjoy as a passion, in hopes that people will also follow and follow your brand.
Ian, what about you? Do you design purely to your own aesthetic or your own passion, or do you design to your audience's feedback?
That's a great question. I tend to design exactly what I want, so I have 100% of my passion and my energy behind it. Because without that passion, I'm not going to want to push forward. And for many years working on the side on my watches, it was between 6 o'clock and 11:30 at night when I was doing that work. So if you didn't have the fire, you would just you wouldn't just watch Netflix. So so to have that passion, I had to be 100% behind what I was building. And to think about what John's saying here, as a designer, and I know John's also a product designer, we love constraints. So when I started designing the watches, it was around, okay, well, what tools do I have access to, and how do I marry the materials that I know I can make with those tools, or work with those tools, and how do I produce geometry that can fit into a watch? So, the dots on my watch are drilled because that's what I could do. And if you look back in time at the early Gens or George Daniels, they all have drilled indices. So it's this marrying of process and tools and design together, and that's kind of what always pushes me off. And what I say is you always have to make one crack at the design, and then everything will start to follow. The cracks will just spread, right? So take a piece of material and you make one cut and you commit to one piece, and then you just kind of follow from there. And that's kind of what pushes me forward, getting deeper and deeper into these manufacturing projects, never knowing where they're going to take me.
Great. Josh, I'd like to hear from you on this too, because I know you take a lot of custom commissions from people. But for the watches that you create, are you mostly coming from your own personal preference on what you would wear, or are you more flexible in your design because you've got clients commissioning you for specific styles?
Well, the truth is, when I was trying to decide on the design aesthetic, I just opened a watch magazine, kind of closed my eyes, and picked a random page, and it was Rolex. I said, I don't want to do that. No, but I've always been inspired by the classical. I'm a historian, so I like old things, and I've always liked the simple layout of a classical dial. And, all these gentlemen up here, we kind of make the watches that we like, that we're excited, that we're passionate about. One of the dangers that you see in the non-disruptors, the big industry, is once you start designing a watch based off of product market research and what other people have to say and committees and boards, it starts to get into a dangerous territory, and you see a lot of brands that come out with watches and it's hit or miss, and the misses can sometimes be really bad. And versus us, where it's small operations, we're making what we're passionate about. And you see it, like, just like every person's different, just like we're all different, we all have our own design ideas, and it's a manifestation of our personalities and what we enjoy and what we like seeing on a watch. And the second you lose that, you're losing something special in the watchmaking or art world as it is. Watches are an art form, and that takes passion and creativity and your own version of that. And so when I make my watches, it's what I like. I like the classical design. And then my customers also come to me with great ideas that they'd like to incorporate. And that's the fun part. That's the fun part, working with another customer, seeing their vision, working in tandem with your vision. And that's common for us as independents. It's something that we can offer. If you look at these guys' watches, they all have really special customizations that customers have come and worked with them on, but you can still see each of our unique design aesthetic still there.
Thank you. So on that note, do you think that the proliferation of independent creators, I feel like in recent years especially, we've seen lots and lots of people start their own watch brands, and Roland, you've been around for longer than the other folks on the panel, but in the last several years, there's just been a ton of independent creators and small brands, and I think the term micro brand some people don't like to use, but that kind of passion project. We actually have some RedBar members who've started their own watch brands, John included. Did it purely out of passion. So, do you think that proliferation of independent creators and those brands are fueling the future of the industry? And if you do, how so? On that note, also, are the independent designers influencing the larger, more traditional brands and actually making them have to think a little harder and change direction? I'm going to put that to Roland first.
It's not an easy question to answer. What do I think? Okay. Well, there's a lot of brands that have popped up, and some will probably survive and others won't. It's not an easy way to starting your own brand, unless you're independently wealthy, which I was not, is not an easy thing to sustain for any length of time. So kind of, some of that will shake out, But I think it's positive to have people coming up with ideas and things, because you're less restricted. Big brands, there's restriction there. There's certain parameters they have to stay within and things, where it was someone who's independent and small can take chances, can do things, can put something out there they just like. And I think all of that kind of fuels the passion for watchmaking and new ideas, and then eventually those big brands see some of that, and then they start to maybe say, well, but that was accepted, and people like that, and then they try a little more, being a little more bold than maybe they would have. And of course, some of them are bold, but there's others that aren't. But what was the second part of your question?
Do you think independent creators are fueling the future of the industry? Do you think that the proliferation of smaller brands is kind of pushing the industry as a whole forward? I think partially also already answered that a little bit.
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think too, it's important to have different ideas coming from different places. Otherwise, it gets kind of boring. And I think the watchmaking years and years ago, it kind of got into that kind of pigeonhole until there were a few independents that popped up in the 80s, like Sven Anderson and the Calabrese were a few of the first that really kind of were doing things their own way. And then That second wave, let's say, I was kind of at the beginning of that. A lot of my friends that are independents from Switzerland and Germany and other places, that I've known for quite some time, they all came slightly after me. So they had a little more opportunities than I did, because when I started, there wasn't much happening. There wasn't a lot. So you had to kind of do it on your own, where a lot of them could, work for this guy, work for that guy, and then eventually kind of you break onto their own, where I kind of had to just forge ahead on my own. Of course, being on this side of the ocean, you're at a disadvantage. If you're in, this is kind of breaking away from your question, but if you're in Switzerland and you want to do something and you want to build a team or whatever, it's quite easily. You can put an ad in the paper, I need a movement finisher, boom. There's 5 of them are at your door, I need a guy that can do this. We don't have that here. So, I had to kind of figure out how to do that. Had to figure out how to do a lot of things over the years and adapt equipment and do different things to actually produce watches. And even when we did our first movement, it took many years of prototyping, testing, and finding a way that we could do it, because it's not an industrial. A lot of people don't realize that movement manufacturing, there's different ways of doing it. There's sort of the craft. You're still using CNC and equipment and hand finishing that, but we're hand building movements. There's raw parts to an individual. There's a lot of adjustment and fitting, and on an industrial scale, that would never work. So if you look at big companies like Rolex and others, that process is fine-tuned and industrialized through millions and millions of dollars, to where they can repeat parts exactly the same over and over. We can have all that interchangeability, and they can make large volumes of movement. That's not what we do.
Right.
So it's a very different business. So I don't know if I answered your question, but if you have another one, let me know.
So what do you think, Josh? Do you think that that the independent creators and the proliferation of kind of smaller brands is pushing the industry as a whole forward?
Yeah, absolutely. America used to be an incredible bastion of watches. What we were producing here, basically before 1960, the quality of the movements, the watches, was astounding, and that disappeared. And now there's been a resurgence everywhere for hand craftsmanship and the appreciation of older arts. And so in America too, you're seeing this big revolution where lots of people are getting excited about watchmaking and watch brands and relearning this art and spreading it and sharing it with everyone here. And that's kind of grown with collectors as well. And I think that's a really positive thing. People have asked me, about competition with other American brands, and I never really feel that. We have such a tiny sliver of the market share. If we can take 1% of the market share from the Swiss, we'll be fantastically rich. So our competitors are the Swiss, and the more brands here in America, that's great. We're able to support each other, we're able to talk, we're able to collaborate, we're able to work with each other and revitalize this industry that's been gone for a long time. And in terms of the big brands, do they feel the pressure or from us? I think yes and no. I think that that they're definitely aware, and some brands more than others, and it really depends on the brand. Like Rolex, I don't see much of an influence from the independent world going on with Rolex. But if you look at other brands that are a little bit more creative or a little smaller, definitely you'll see them see what's going on in the independent world and adapt that. And, many brands have been born that way. So it's complicated, but yeah, the big brands are definitely aware, and some are making changes on that.
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit, change a little bit of direction and talk about materials. And this is first a question for Ian. So how do you come across and discover innovative materials? And also, you can talk a little bit about the mad scientist aspect here, where you figured out how to make your crystalline titanium, but what leads, and all of you can answer this as well, but what leads you to those discoveries, and what leads you to your choice of materials, and how do you find and manipulate innovative materials?
So when I started working in product design, we had these spec sheets that we'd have to create called CMF specs, color, material, and finish. And you'd build essentially a document, a flat piece of paper a lot of the times, that would describe the richness and textures of this future amazing toilet brush, or whatever you're designing, right? And when I was working at IDEO, we had a great library of different swatches of materials and different finishes, and it always fascinated me, like, how did we get there? How did we get to this spun, brushed finish? What is that speckled, sandblasted texture? Like, what's the full process? Because what we often be looking at in design is the end result, and we just say, figure it out to the factory. So my personal mission when I was at that company was to build a bigger tech box and to find out the answer from the start to the finish as to how we got there. So I would go out to machine shops and factories, a lot locally in Massachusetts at the time, and I would talk to them like, how did we get this finish? How do we achieve these textures? And I'd bring back samples, and I would kind of chronicle day one to wherever it took us to get that interesting finish. And as this process started to evolve, I started to discover things along the way. So it's like, oh wow, the raw piece of material looks almost more interesting to me than the finished piece. And I was working on some aerospace related stuff for a client, and I was working with a lot of titaniums, and I noticed titanium takes a fingerprint. It catches oil really nicely, or not so nicely in the watch industry. And I was like trying to figure out how to manipulate that, and there was a project where we needed to make sure that the titanium was annealed and the calmest, most predictable state of the titanium. So the way you would do that is you'd look at the crystalline structure, and you look under a scanning electron microscope at the titanium, and you look at the grain boundaries of the material, and you'd start to see what state is this in? Has it been compressed and forged? Like if you look at a Rolex case, those cases are pressed, and you compress the material, it gives it different grain structure, different properties. So we look at the titanium and say, where are we? What is this? And I saw these patterns under the scanning electron microscope of these grain boundaries that were just striking and beautiful. And I said, well, what if we could make this really big? And it kind of like floated around for a little bit in my head. And then I saw a German knife maker had a crystalline knife blade. And then I saw Grand Seiko had this crystalline rotor, these crystallized dials. And I was like, what the heck is this? And so I started working with a material scientist, dug a little bit deeper, and we produced some samples, actually funny enough in Pennsylvania, using a combination of heat and time and pressure to manipulate the titanium. And I found this crystalline structure to be appealing to me from the technical perspective, and the art perspective. It begs the question, like, what is this? And starts a conversation about why we made this, or why we make in general, right? Or why small brands should exist to bring you these types of things. So it was like the combination, discovering like this process and working it into a watch case, whether or not it looks good, was kind of like the culmination of like art, technology, engineering, material science, manufacturing, and to me, like all of my work, if it could be at that intersection, is like the biggest and best thing that brings me the most joy. So I kind of discovered by doing, and I just you take one step in and you try and find the best experts and look at the trade publications and the white papers and look at other industries. What are people in the defense industry doing? They've spent so much money developing materials that do X, Y, and Z. Why don't we borrow some of that? And a lot of it's public knowledge. So I enjoy reading these like long 40-page PDFs about tantalum or like trabecular metal or whatever, stuff used in implants in the body. And thankfully through my consulting work, I also have a decent network of people that I can ping and say, how did you make that structure that the bone grows into in that ankle replacement? What is that? And how strong is it? And let's make a case out of it. Like, what's that? So it's been really fun. That's like kind of my my raison d'etre right now. So cool.
This is why I always call him the mad scientist, because that approach I think is it's really interesting. Like and I think because you are independent and you're a small brand, you have sort of the freedom and to take those kinds of risks, which is I think kind of inherent with your own company. You have your own vision. You can take a little bit more risk than some of the larger brands that are beholden to stockholders and layers of management. For the rest of you, how do you work with materials? How do you choose the materials you're working with? And from an innovation standpoint, how do you approach using sort of innovative tools or modern tools to achieve some of the things? Like what I saw the lasers being used for your hand creation in your workshop. So using sort of like the innovative modern approach, what things do you not want to mess with? Like what if you're, instead of maybe using an innovative or a new material, are there things that you just will never abandon because they work really well for you?
Yeah. So materials is actually a lot of fun. Like to make the comparison to an artist, materials for metalsmiths are both the paint and the canvas. And for me, that's one of the enjoyable parts is learning what different materials will do, how different materials react to heat in different ways. For instance, my dials, the silver that I use is a sterling silver alloy. Sterling silver tarnishes. So this sterling silver alloy is called true silver. It has germanium inside of it that helps it keep it from tarnishing. And the process I do is I heat up the dial. It turns black on the top from impurities in the sterling silver. That other sterling silver is 92.5% silver and 7.5 other things. And so the impurities come up to the top. I put that in acid, and it leaves a pure matte white finish. And it takes a bunch of times to get that process right. And one of the learning curves was how is it different with this special true silver alloy, this non-tarnishing alloy. And on top of that, how does that affect the machinability, the flatness of the piece? There's a lot of variables with every new material. Steel is a completely different world than silver. And platinum is its own thing. Every metal sort of has its own flavor and feel, both in how it looks and how it feels, and how it machines and how you work with it. And that's kind of the fun part, the discovery. Like, how am I going to cut this on the machine? What tools I'm going to have to use, or what new tools do I have to get? It used to be steel, hardened steel was the tool that people would use to do machining with. Now there's special carbide alloys or ceramic or diamond, and it's sort of like what paintbrush are you going to use to achieve what you want to do. And that's a fun part of discovery. And recently I worked pretty exclusively for my dials in silver, and recently I tried German silver, which is used in a lot of movements as the base plate. And that was a completely different feel under the machine, and it produced a completely different result. And that was kind of really interesting to see how that would happen.
So it sounds like you guys, there's a lot of experimentation in your material choices. Roland, how do you approach material choices when you're working on your watches?
Depending on if it's a dial, for instance, we will use either argentium silver, gold. We have enamel dials, poison A dials, wood marquetry dials. These are not groundbreaking modern technologies. These are traditional, classic ways of making dials, and many are an art form. So with cases, we only use solid metal. So we don't use any coatings, platings, PVDs, any of that. So it's either stainless steel, gold, platinum, or titanium. These are materials that I know well and I know will last, and they can be refinished. And that's one of the reasons we stay away from anything with any kind of a coating or plating, because it's not always going to be able to sort of be brought back to looking good. So it's part of the philosophy that I've had since I started was not to do that. I want to be able to clean up the cases and all. Some of the brands we do service for and things like that, we see the limitations of those. They may look great when they're new and you may really like it, but there's a point where it's probably not going to look so good again. When it comes to movements, we're still using very traditional materials, nickel silver, German silver, and also using steel again. And then the finishing of those materials. So we aren't really using any modern, scientific testing like Ian is down the end there. But it's what I like to do. I like, our watches are very traditional, so we're refining, how we do those things and not really looking for some scientific or space age type of a material. So that's sort of the boring answer to that. So.
Yeah, there's a value to traditional techniques, obviously. So. Thank you. So I have a sort of fun question. I'll start with, for all of you, but I'm going to start with John. What are some ways that you think modernization or using modern techniques or high technology, what are the ways that that's serving the industry, and do you think there are ways that it's harming the industry?
Yes, I think that is a good question for me because so the manufacturers that I work with day to day, they produce quantities per month that are in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of units. These are the guys not specifically doing like fossil movado, but that type of scale. So when you think about that, their way of producing these watches, their techniques, their methodology is produce as many as we can, efficiently, rapidly, and QC it's all basically standardized. So when you talk about modernization with these guys, they're all using CNC machines as little as possible and stamping as much as possible because they want to get these out. And another thing you can notice with these mass-produced watches is that even the finishing. When you look at an RGM watch, you can look at it on every single profile and you can see, oh my God, like this side of this case has definitely hit the CNC machine. And not only has the machine taken care of this, but somebody had to hand finish this, whether it was brushed or polished, had to be masked off. So for someone like myself, I say, well, I'm going to be working with these manufacturers that push out hundreds of thousands of units per year. How can I challenge them to produce a better product for myself? Because if I do another mass-produced watch from their factory, then it'll blend into the whole ecosystem of watches in general, and I won't last. So I actually push them to say, hey, I would like the watch to have different finishing on the top, the side, that every single angle has a different finishing. To which they respond with, are you kidding me? Like, they won't say that physically. They'll just send me a super high price tag, to which I'll say, no. There's a method and strategy to how you can break this down with the brushing, the polishing, the sandblasting, and we can do it efficiently. So since I have a product design background, I could really spell it all out. What we were talking about before, and it was a good point you made, is there's just so many waves of people entering the watch industry. It becomes quite saturated. So they're used to punching out lots of units. They're not used to somebody saying, or challenging them, saying, I would like this really carefully finished, down to, like, for instance, the watch hands are even vertically brushed. These are usually just turned out, just brass plates, just stamped, and then it gets plated or painted and thrown on. For them to go an extra stage and brush it however I'd like, or add lume in specific ways, it's these challenges that they're not used to. So there are modern manufacturing techniques out there to get them out, but I think it's or at least my opportunity to challenge them with this equipment to produce really high-end watches.
Great. Anybody else that wants to chime in on this? Do you think modern techniques are, how are they helping the industry, and are they harming it in any way?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things with the modernization of machines is transparency. This is sort of like a big philosophical outlook on watches, but a lot of brands, especially on the other side of the ocean, marketing is a huge component for them. And they may say or give off the image that their watch is very handmade and it's completely manufactured with very little human input through $20, $30 million CNC machines where it can do everything. But that's not how they're portraying themselves. And one of the struggles we have here in America is our laws on how we can say made in the USA are very different than in Switzerland. And so in terms of modern manufacturing processes, you'll see that most Americans are pretty transparent with how they're making their parts. And if they're not, then the Federal Trade Commission is going to have a talk with them. And that's very different than our competitors across the ocean and the laws they have there. So versus 100 years ago where everyone was kind of making watches the same way. And there was nothing to hide because everyone was using manual machinery. And so I think that's a very sticky issue. And I think that's one of the downsides of having all these incredible technologies out there, and technologies that can mass produce watches in ways that have never been done before. But then how are you portraying yourselves? How are you actually making your watches? How much hand time is actually going into these watches? And that's something that I think independents battle with a lot versus some of the bigger brands about these processes. For instance, for me, I'm in the engine turning world a lot, and there are brands that portray themselves as doing hand engine turning, but they're CNC, and that really only hurts the industry rather than helping, because then there's confusion amongst customers. Well, is this stamped, or is this CNC'd, or is it done by hand? I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think I would like to open it up for questions from the audience. Do we have a mic?
No, not for the audience.
We do not have a mic for the audience. So yeah, I'll open it up for questions. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
Have you guys put yourself into the thought of doing something similar that would help pursuing also a lot of hype or communication effort on social media, and how are these other guys are doing?
So the question is, we've seen collaboration amongst watchmakers and brands in Switzerland. Are the American brands, or yourselves included, thinking about doing something similar? Go ahead.
I'll chime in because I'm obsessed with social media. I think we all are, but I'm really into it because I like to engage with people. But there's only so much you can do on your own, where collaborations are key for not only it's for reaching markets that I otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. So for instance, I reached out to Johnny Dowell, if you know King Nerd. He's based in London. I never go to London, but how cool would that be to work with him, produce a few collaborative units, and he hand engraved the case backs. He hand engraved 5 pieces with little coffee mugs on the back, and then he had a gold fill for the coffee inlay. And it was just like, this is a beautiful timepiece. We both were doing what we love and enjoy, but from a strategic standpoint, he gets to reach the New York and American audience, and then he's basically dropping like a little bomb of like New York City over there, saying like, I'm working on a New York City brand watch, check it out. And there's an instant collaborative effort that worked for both of our benefits. And one other, I enjoy working with artists because it's very difficult to find other people who are just as passionate as you are about your brand. So they're putting their very best into their work because their name is on it. The old saying is, you'll never find somebody that will love what you do as much as you. So it's very hard to hire people or work with people but when you find these passionate individuals, like another person he's called Sunflower Man, his name is Matthew Miller. He travels the world on his artwork, him and his wife. His wife's an animator, and reached out to him, built a relationship where he would do these beautiful illustrations of my watches, these motifs, these lifestyle drawings. And again, it's just like a collaborative effort of sharing. And from my point of view, from a brand point of view, I do see an influx, a large volume of his market crossing over to my side and vice versa. So both doing what we love, both benefiting from it, and I think that's key for this type of industry to continue moving forward.
To add to that, John and I have been talking about doing a project together, so I'm putting you on blast. We got to finish that project. Very good. A lot of American independents know each other. Like Josh and I have met before this panel, and a lot of us do like collaborate in the way that we share process in terms of how we make specific parts. Like we talked about hands for how long? Like last night, like long time, almost too long. It was great. But you guys don't necessarily have a window into that, so maybe we do need to be more transparent with that and say, hey, we did work together. And I know John's worked with a number of other watch brands, and I've worked with a number of other American watch brands to produce things that are greater than the sum of one atelier, one shop, right? But it's not always public because there's marketing confusion. It's like, do we want to bring attention to that brand? Do they want to bring attention to us? Do we just exchange money? Do we exchange ideas? So it's complicated in the same way that overseas there might be some collaboration that we don't see as well. So sometimes the business gets in the way of the public face of what we want to show, but we just can't show it. So I've worked with other brands. It's been really rewarding, really amazing at times, and that's been really good. But what I'm hoping to see in the next wave is, whether we have designers who are designing innovative watches, working with American manufacturers, or manufacturers trading processes or combining processes. I mean, I'd like to see a lot more of it, and I think the minute we start to have more capability within the hands of these creators, and if they have open minds, we'll see that. So I have the ability to make cases and dials and hands, fantastic. Josh has the ability to make incredible dials and hands. We need people who have access to the knowledge of horology to create main plates or to even source movements, because this is a very tricky process for American brands. I've had trouble sourcing movements in the past, but maybe if we did a group buy across a couple independents and we all built a module on top of that base movement, we could all have something more horologically interesting, and we could be open and transparent about that collaboration. So I think it's coming. There's a lot of text messages and emails and phone calls going back and forth, but it's a young industry and it's coming back up. And there's, I've found a lot of challenges in the business side of it, like how do we even pay for Josh and I working together, or another watchmaker and I working together. It's been very challenging, and maybe it goes off the beaten path, and there's a lot of R&D, so there's a little bit more friction. So hopefully we'll remove that friction in the future by selling more watches and being more comfortable in what we do, and having the time to really step out of our workshops and work together. So.
Next question?
Hey, so I'm just wondering, when you're designing the watch, how much of the work do you do it in Sketchpad? Do you do it in Adobe Illustrator? Or you just start cutting metal? What for each of you? What is your process? Where do you start to form the idea before the milling and all that stuff begins?
Yeah, the question is, what's your process? Basically, what's your design process?
It depends on designing an aesthetic design for what a watch might look like, or if we're working on something more technical. The idea for any watch kind of starts in my head about what I might want to make. But when it gets down to having to make drawings and things like that, we use the computer. We use Fusion 360. We used to use a couple other softwares, but we've moved to this cloud-based system, which works well for us. So we can design dials on there, hands, movement parts, cases. And then, you know, it gives us a technical drawing that we can work from if the part is made by us or if there's something that has to be made on the outside. We can provide you know, a proper drawing there. But aesthetically, sometimes we'll even just start with a sketch or something, just trying to formulate what something might look like. So again, it's kind of the blend of old and new.
John, same question?
So when I'm working on the watch, I'll first come out with a mission statement of where I want to go before I even start creating. From my mission statement, I'll go to hand sketching, usually very rough, just getting silhouettes, proportions down. For my sketch, I'll take that to an Adobe Illustrator rendering. For those of you who don't know, Adobe Illustrator is a 2D drawing vector program, kind of like AutoCAD, where I'll draw my watch in 2D, proportionally 100% scale, correct? And from those, I can print it out and see that, oh, okay, it's going to be this size. Is that too large, too small? Which to my next thought would be, well, I need to do a 3D model of this. So I'll take my 2D vector drawing and then I'll do my 3D work in SolidWorks. So it's a different program. And from that SolidWorks file, I'll 3D print it. So this is just like me in my room working on all these stages. And then when I have my 3D print, then I can look at it on every profile and say, is this wearable? Because we're always saying, what is the most wearable? Is it the 38, is it the 40 millimeter? But to be honest, you know, every watch silhouette shape wears differently, depending on, is it on a bracelet, is it square, is it round? Like there's different proportions and illusions that play on your eye. You know, you're like, oh, this is a 40, oh, it looked like a 38. Like there's so many different illusions. The cool part is the more you do this, the more you're able to figure out what is the most wearable product. And also, I'm not so much creating movements, so I know the dimensions of the movements, I know the dimensions of the case, the tolerances you need to make it water resistant. So at that end, I would make my technical drawing and then finally share it with my supplier. So he's happy, I just made his life easy. You know, I did, you know, A to Y, he just has to do Z, which is take this and plug and chug and share it with his network of suppliers. But from there, then it's prototyping and stage after stage.
Josh, how about you?
So watchmaking and watch designing is an interesting play between form and function. You can design the coolest, most amazing watch in the whole world, but if it doesn't work with your movement or the movement you're designing, well, there goes that design. So those are two things that, you know, watch designers are always thinking about. What can I do and how am I limited by my function?